podcast. Bonnie and Mike and Tim all have gathered virtually to introduce a really interesting interview. So first let me intro the book. The book we're discussing today is a book called Romans Disarmed. And it's written by two scholars, Brian Walsh and Sylvia Keesmaat. And they wrote a book years and years and years ago called Colossians Remixed. It was one of the coolest commentaries I've ever read because it blended like fictional characters and I mean, it just had it had several different genres in the book to make kind of the point about how subversive Colossians is to empire. So I was super stoked when I saw that they had a book coming out. It's so funny. They're married and they live on a farm, a permaculture farm, 2 hours outside of Toronto. They don't have cell phones. And it's really, and they get into, like, in the book, they really get into, like, why. I mean, it's unbelievable. But all that is to say, we had a very poor connection, and they drop out a couple of times, but there's still, like, good stuff here, so we're gonna, Tim's done his best to clean it up, but we're still gonna, with apologies, release it. And then Bonnie had a great idea. Last episode we talked about, hey, how we do interviews and should we ever disagree or whatever. And Bonnie had a great idea out of that. Bonnie, why don't you go ahead and share that?
Yeah, I thought it would be a good idea to do a shorter intro and then listen to the interview and then us three come back on for like an outro and sort of discuss what was said on the interview. Because I think, like you said, we want to model listening when we have the guests on. We want to be generous towards them and let them have their best stuff. But we also want to show that, like, we're being thoughtful about these ideas and sort of critiquing where it needs to be or just discussing them at least. And it might give you guys as the community sort of places that you can then further the discussion.
No, that's really good. Because we keep hearing that you want to hear what we're thinking.
Yeah,
as we're
about
doing
some of these topics.
Yes, exactly. So Bonnie, freaking genius idea. That's why Bonnie is no longer co-host. She is host. I am producer, and Tim has now been promoted to just, I don't know, the face of the podcast.
On pins and needles for that one.
All right, so this is Sylvia and Brian, and I was so stoked, and forgive me, I fanboy all over the place because this is one step closer to N.T. Wright, because she studied under N.T. Wright, but also I've read not all their books, but several of their books, and I've just great respect, even though we certainly don't agree on everything, so I was a little bit geeked out, and forgive me for not maintaining my journalistic professionalism. Anyway,
hope thinks that when they think of Mike Eries.
It's fangirling. Wait, can you give some background? How is the book written? Is it written like their opinion? Is it a commentary? Is it like a message thing? Like, what's happening in the book? How is it written? So people sort of have some context.
Okay, it is a commentary that includes laments for creation, targums, which were interpretations and translations from the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic. So when Israel came back from exile, not everyone spoke Hebrew, and so what they would do, the teachers and the rabbis would read the Hebrew, but then they would translate it into Aramaic and add commentary. And those translations plus commentaries are called targums. They actually use that device in the book. They have a couple of fictional characters where you kind of enter into first century Rome through their eyes. They do some exegetical work. So it's a whole combo. That was what was brilliant about Colossians Remixed, was it was like commentary that was different than every other commentary.
Nice.
Romans Disarmed is very similar to that. And then they get into some really, like, they talk about watersheds, and being aware of your local watershed and where you get your water. They have a whole chapter on environmental issues. So it's this really eclectic combo of commentary, and then their reflections on what that commentary would look like played out today against empire, and obviously empire for them, and for most these days means kind of the American sort of hegemony. So anyway, it's super interesting,
cool.
Very controversial, but the conversation is certainly worth having. So thanks for that clarification. But anyway, hope you folks enjoy it, and we'll meet you on the other side. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Vox Podcast. I am Mike Erie, and I'm so glad to be with you today. And I have live from 2 hours outside of Toronto, two scholars that I cannot believe I get a chance to talk with. Sylvia Keesmaat and Brian Walsh are the authors of a book that was so incredibly important to me when I was younger, called Colossians Remixed. And they've just come out with a new book called Romans Disarmed. Sylvia and Brian, welcome to the show. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
It's great to be here.
Thank you. They, if you don't know, these two are probably the most unique scholars I think I've ever read. They live out in unbelievably powerful ways what it is they're inviting people into. They live on a farm, and it's amazing, and I'm sure you get asked about that all the time. But I would love to talk very generally before we get to the specifics about the book. When you guys look at Christianity in the West, and Canada and America, what is it that concerns you, and what is it that gives you hope these days?
Oh my goodness.
I know, right?
What concerns me is that Christendom isn't dying quick enough. I just wish the whole thing would die a lot quicker death, and not find itself in this situation of having made such an incredibly unholy alliance with the empire. I kind of stopped. I call myself an evangelical when I'm around non-evangelicals. But when I'm around evangelicals, I kind of stay away from the term, and especially in the United States of America. I am so disheartened by the apostasy of the evangelical church, having got in bed with nationalism and white supremacy, and a president of such incredibly low moral character and dictatorial tendencies. So sorry to start off on such a bummer there.
No, I asked, absolutely, and I figured I'd get something fiery.
Yeah.
So I love it. I love it.
And where I find incredible encouragement, though, is in folks young and old who are really seeking for an alternative path of discipleship that wants to take much more seriously what it means that Jesus is Lord, what it means that love is the power of the universe, and how that works its way out in literally every dimension of our lives. Now that gets me pretty excited.
Sylvia, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think one thing I would say is that I think Christianity finds itself in this unholy alliance because very early on, Christianity made an alliance with a kind of Platonist philosophy that separated us from our bodily earthly life, right? It became all about getting to heaven. Yeah. And if it's all about getting to heaven, then it doesn't matter so much if the world's going to hell in a handbasket, because we're going to be whisked away anyway, right?
Yeah.
And people are now starting, we have young people now for whom it's not unusual for them to say, but of course it's about the new earth and it's about the resurrection. Right. And that means we need to be deeply concerned about creation and need to be deeply concerned about our social structures. And so there is also, I think, a lot of hope in where people people are sort of becoming aware that the biblical worldview is not about being whisked away to heaven, but it's about embodied, faithful, creaturely life on earth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How do you see the Bible being co-opted in the tribal, kind of the tribal conflicts these days? I love that you point to each other. I think it's fantastic because I don't know who the best one to ask to, so I'm just throwing it out and figure you guys will respond in kind. But how do you see the Bible co-opted? Because where I want to get to is just why Romans and why disarm Romans. But before I even get to the specific book, the Bible is being used in these tribal wars. What do you observe about that? What would you see as corrections needed for that?
Well, I think one of the things that happens is, and this has always happened, and it happens on both sides of almost every issue, is that people use the Bible in a very, first individualistic and secondly proof texting kind of way, right? Right. So God isn't talking necessarily to a community of people. God isn't trying to shape a community of people, but God is giving us individual moral pointers for how to live. That's good. And if that's how you think about the text, then it's very easy to just sort of abstract texts here and there outside of the larger narrative. Right. If, however, you realize that this is a book about God's shaping of a community that will be for the healing of the earth and for all the nations of the earth, right? Because that's what the call of Abraham was for, right? The story very quickly turns from a good creation into a creation that is distorted and cursed. And the whole rest of the story is God's working to bring healing and redemption and forgiveness into that situation of evil and brokenness. And how does God decide to do that? Well, by calling Abraham. God doesn't say to Abraham, I want you to have a close personal relationship with me, Abraham. He says, Abraham, I'm choosing you. I'm choosing you because your offspring are going to bless all the nations of the earth. You are going to be the community that shows the whole world what it is to live in faithful relationship with God in a community that is intended for healing and redemption. And the whole of the book is about that. And unless we start reclaiming that whole narrative and that whole calling, that what does that community look like? What is God calling us to be together as a society, as a church, as a people, as a neighborhood? Actually, that's even a better question. Unless we're kind of looking for that kind of a narrative thread to hold the text together, we're invariably going to fall into this individualistic proof texting kind of reading of the text.
Oh my goodness.
I would imagine a lot of your listeners would be able to quote 2 Timothy 3:16, which is, all scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for every good work.
He's such a Bible thumper, isn't he?
There you are. I'm a convert, so I know this stuff. And I really important that the first two things there, I mean, it's for teaching and then reproof and correction, right?
Right.
And it seems to me that the scriptures have also been co-opted as the legitimation of theological systems. So that once you theologize the scriptures and you boil it down, and that's probably the right metaphor, boil it down to kernels of eternal truth that become doctrines. You lose you lose the dynamic narrative character of the scriptures.
Absolutely.
And then you also end up with a text that gets read through the lens of those doctrines.
Yes.
And that means that invariably the text very seldom corrects or reproves us and doesn't teach us anymore because we already have it figured out. Yeah. So, and now everybody's guilty of this. If every time you read the scriptures confirm what you already thought, then you're undoubtedly misreading the scriptures, right? so the scriptures need to be corrected and reproved. All of us, include us. But there is a certain way in the tradition of Christendom where the scriptures have been co-opted into a system of theological doctrines. So you can read Romans and you can find the Roman road in Romans, what's the path to salvation.
Yeah.
And it is, as Sylvia said, a bunch of proof texts, but also not only does it close us down to the dynamic living word of God,
yeah,
but it also means that the text invariably becomes a weapon that you use against your theological enemies.
Come on.
You know?
So we're preaching.
Now we're preaching.
Are we preaching yet? I mean, this is amazing.
Well, and that text goes on, and for training in justice. Usually it's translated, the scriptures are also for training in righteousness.
Yeah.
But that Greek word is dikaiosune,
right.
Which also occurs a lot in Romans. And that's, dikaiosune is a translation of two Hebrew words, justice and righteousness. And so the overtones of justice are always there. So yes, the scriptures are also there for training us how to act justly. What is it to shape that just society? What is it to interact with people justly? And that little bit gets dropped off usually of that verse.
And
absolutely.
It ends with, and enabling us for all forms of good works, right? This is a text that is only alive when it becomes alive in the praxis of the Christian community, and that is a radical discipleship praxis.
Oh, my Lord. Okay. I'm just going to take notes. I'm just going to stop asking questions. And you guys, I just want to hear you talk for 30 minutes. Well, I mean, when I was in seminary, I had 4 systematic theology classes. Mm-hmm. And what we did
we're sorry for that.
I know. Oh, me too. Me too. I mean, what an impoverished way of coming to theology. Here's doctrine of the Holy Spirit. Here's the doctrine of the church. And it's just lists of texts. And you systematize your faith, and exactly right. You can't help but weaponize it. So how do you guys, it sounds like you're familiar enough with that way of doing this. How have you guys learned to approach the text differently in a way that opens it up and leaves us more full than hungry?
Oh, well, I guess there's a couple of different things. One is that we tend to approach the text as a narrative. Mm-hmm. So, how is the narrative working? If this is the story of God's interaction with the world and God's interaction with first the people of Israel and God's interaction with us, what does that tell us about how God wants to be in relationship with us, and what lengths God is willing to go to stay in relationship with us? Mm-hmm. So, for instance, people will talk all kinds of different ways about the atonement, but when I'm talking to my students in class, one of the things I say is, well, just what does the story tell us about how sin affects God, right? And how God goes about making things right with us. And what the story tells us is that God is grieved. Mm-hmm. God is incredibly sad about this. And always in the prophets, when you have language about, God's anger, the God word side of that anger is always grief. Mm-hmm. It's often couched in language of grief and sorrow.
And parents can understand that. That's very much a parental, like a father, mother. Yeah,
that's exactly it. And so what does that tell us? So the whole idea of the atonement, that's popular in evangelical circles, that God is pissed off with us, and so somebody has to die, and it's going to be Jesus. He sticks it to Jesus. That doesn't fit in with that kind of grief. The reason, Paul even says in Romans, the reason Jesus died for us is because God loved us. God's love for us went so far that Jesus took on this suffering on the cross and was willing to bear evil. And so to break the power of evil. Mm-hmm. And so, all of that is better informed by a narrative than by trying to rationally think through how God works in the world.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of it, approaching things narratively.
How do you do that with an epistle? So when you get to Romans, how do you when it's not clearly although it's embedded in context, of course. How do you do that within a letter like Romans?
Well, with Romans, it's actually pretty easy. Once you get rid of your theological bias that this is systematic theology, Paul is engaging in storytelling all the way through. I mean, he has a whole chapter on Abraham. He has a whole chapter on Adam. He has 3 chapters on the history of Israel. So the
excellent answer. Excellent.
Yeah, so the whole epistle is rooted not just in those texts, but all the way through in a narrative. And the narrative is, of course, the narrative of Israel radically interpreted in the light of the story of Jesus, placed in the context of another narrative, which is the meta-narrative of the Roman Empire. Right. So we have now 3 narratives going on: Jesus story, Israel story, Roman story, and then there's at least a 4th, and that is what's the story going on in these communities in Rome at this time? What's the problem? What are the dynamics in that community? What's their story? And
I didn't realize I gave you the biggest softball question in the history of the world. That was amazing. That's so good. Holy cow.
We almost had to arm wrestle to see who would answer it.
Now, why Romans?
Well, Romans. I mean, the short answer to that is, I did part of my doctoral dissertation on Romans, and I've been reading around in Romans for a while. But also Romans is, it's a bit of a challenge. Like you said, you didn't realize that was a softball question for us, but for most people, Romans is this incredibly daunting book. It seems like this
absolutely.
Theologically heavy. People just say, when we ask people what they most love, and we ask people sometimes what most attracts you to Romans and what most repels you. Yeah. And a lot of people just say, well, I can't figure out what the heck he's talking about.
Right.
So that's part of it. But Romans also just has some of the most beautiful language in the epistles. A lot of people go to Romans for solace. But conversely, Romans also has been used most often as a weapon to beat up on all kinds of communities and all kinds of people in and outside of the church. So it felt like Romans was a text that itself needed to be disarmed, needed a redemptive and healing word itself. We have a lot of students who have been traumatized by Romans. So for them, I don't think we realized this when we started, but now that we've taught this a few times, there are people who thank us for freeing Romans for them and making it possible for them to read it again. So in the end, the book has ended up being a pastoral endeavor, which of course most writing should be a pastoral endeavor. So
yeah, I loved that you had talked about Romans because it's the core. It seemed, and I could be overgeneralizing, but it seems like it represents the core of the evangelical subculture that many of us are wrestling with. So you have Romans 13 and submission to authorities. You've got Romans 1 and sexuality. You've got predestination and the neo-reformed movement, 9 through 11, which just seems, indecipherable. You do have all the classic words: justification, faith, righteousness, right? So it seems like the thing I thought was so interesting was that this is kind of the heart of the evangelical. If I could refer to the evangelical industrial complex, Romans is kind of at the heart of that.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So. And again, I'm sure there are many other reasons why you went after it. But when you approach a book like Romans, where do you begin? So it sounds like one of the things you're doing is saying, hey, okay, here are 4 narratives that are going on. But how do you personally enter into a text like that to begin to open it up?
Yeah, I mean, we could answer that in all kinds of ways. I mean, on one level, you do new kinds of historical scholarship. You come to this text asking new questions. So what happens if you come to Romans and the question that you ask is, how would a slave have heard this epistle? How would a Jew who had been in Rome for a very long time, living at subsistence, how would he have heard this? So you end up uncovering new historical data, in a sense, or new historical perspectives by asking new historical questions. But I think that the other way to talk about that, to go back to Sylvia's very first answer, and the narrative, the story, which you notice she immediately went to the grief of God, that this is a story suffused with grief, the Israel's story. Jesus is a man of sorrows. And so then the question becomes, what access do we as cisgendered, white, privileged couple, what access do we have to Romans if it's not through sorrow? And so we found our way, our entrance, even I would say, we hermeneutic suffering. And we do so because we think the scriptures do so. And we think that, in fact, Paul to such sorrow. He's very clear about that at the beginning of chapter 9, but you can feel the pathos, I think, already in chapter 1. So the book, our book, begins actually in a place of pathos, at a party in Toronto, and a homeless man weeping uncontrollably on the side of the dance floor, weeping for his friend Iggy Spoon. And Iggy was a friend of ours as well, an Aboriginal First Nations man who died much, much too young. So that place of sorrow becomes sort of our hermeneutical entrance. What does it sound like if we can begin to empathetically, because it's not our experience, the experience of being an Indigenous person, but empathetically try to hear this text from that place of sorrow. I just want to also share with you that the night that we launched the book, we launched it in the very same place, and we talked about that very same dance floor. And it was an amazing evening. A song called Iggy's Song was performed, probably for the last time because it's too painful to play. 2 hours after our party ended, there was a murder about 100 feet from that site. And it was Iggy's best friend.
Oh my goodness.
James Smith. And so we begin the book in sorrow. We launched the book remembering that sorrow, and by 2 hours after the launch, we're right back into the damn sorrow.
Oh my goodness.
And it's incredibly hard.
Yeah.
But somehow we think that maybe following the way of the cross has to put us in those places, though I don't want to be there.
No, and nor does American Christianity want you there, right? I mean, we don't know how to lament. I mean, you speak so much of lament. You have a lament for creation in here that's, I mean, I've never seen anything like it. And so I'm so glad I asked the question that way, because I don't know that I would ever think of approaching a text through a pathos like that. I always, again, seminary, I'm looking for the historical grammatical reading here, and and we kind of go from there. So absolutely wonderful work, and I'm so sorry to hear about your friend. I mean, that is awful. And Romans has this unique sort of, it ends in, there's this striking note of hope throughout the book too that you guys capture very well. When you when you get to some of the very seemingly well understood passages of atonement and justification and wrath, God put to satisfy his justice, God put Jesus forward, and so on. How do you arrive at a reading? Because I think what will really surprise people is that you're presenting an anti-imperial reading of a lot of these very classic sort of individual salvation texts, And I was wondering if we could just get into one example of that, whichever. I mean, we started on righteousness actually meaning justice. But I'd love to, because I think I've heard in some circles the beginning of kind of the anti-imperial pushback.
Right.
You know, that there's hey, we're seeing politics, however you define that, where it doesn't exist. And so I would want to hear a bit about how you would respond to that. Because I'm sure some people will be like, really? I mean, this is. And I love the questioner, the skeptic that's in there. That is a genius maneuver, because you use that person so very well to deal with some of these things.
Maybe we should explain to your listeners how that works.
Yeah, go ahead, if you would.
So we have a questioner or an interlocutor, as we did in Colossians Remix, and every now and then, we happily going along saying what we want to say, and her voice interrupts, usually in italics, always in italics, and she says, "Wait a minute, can I ask a question here?"
Yeah.
And she shows up throughout the book.
That's so good.
One whole chapter is just conversation with her. That's the chapter on sexuality, and it's in that chapter that she tips her hand, or we tip her hand of her gender, and it's a technique which we, as a writing technique, it's a way that we hope allows the questions that the listener or the reader might actually be having. The reader gets to one of those interruptions and says, "Yeah, that's exactly what we think too."
No,
that's my question. So
absolutely.
So back to your question.
And they are the questions that we have heard presenting this stuff on Romans over the last 10, 12 years in various parts of the world. So that's so they are actually very immediate questions. But back to the imperial, the question about the imperial reading of the text and the pushback. I mean, I think part of why we haven't before been attuned to a lot of the imperial overtones of what's going on in the text is just that a lot of the language has become just familiar theological language to us. We use the language of gospel, talk about gospel. When we say peace be with you, we have a certain meaning we pour into that. Even the word righteousness, dikaiosune, or justice as we translate it. A lot of these words had specific overtones in the first century that were used quite politically. And we don't pick them up because we aren't in the first century. I mean, it's kind of like, when you read Shakespeare in high school and there's always these little footnotes on the side explaining what all the words mean. It's kind of would be helpful if we had that for some of the things in the Bible more often. Yeah. And we do have study notes at the bottom. Yeah. But often they're interpreted from that theological paradigm again, the systematic theology paradigm, and not historically in terms of the first century. So, for instance, when Paul at the beginning of Romans says that, he's proclaiming the gospel of God's Son. And he says the word gospel a bunch of times in that first chapter. They were expecting a victory parade to go along with that. And they were expecting to see the spoils of victory coming with that good news. Those were the overtones. So when Paul very specifically says which gospel he's talking about, it's the gospel of Jesus, it's the gospel of God, when he's writing this letter, so that they'll know that this isn't the imperial gospel, that this is a challenge. And the empires, this was the Pax Romana, right? The empire of peace. So when Paul talks about being a people of peace and whenever possible live peaceably with one another, he's using the language that the empire uses for the way that they act. But everybody knows that Romans peace is the result of violence, right? And actually that's the language of our culture too, right? For a long time, the Canadian Army, we were called peacemakers. It was a peacemaking army. That's how we styled it. We still went out with guns and intervened all over the world with guns, but we called them peacemaking missions, which is a very disingenuous way to describe guys who are out there engaging in acts of violence, right? So, and that's what Rome did too. So part of the pushback is because people are saying, well, these are theological terms. They can't have political overtones. But of course they did in the Old Testament too, right? In Isaiah, the word gospel meant God was coming, God is coming to save Israel, right? And that was a political salvation. When the psalmist called out to God for salvation, they were saying, come and defeat our enemies. That's what salvation would look like. Yeah. And so even in Israel's story, these words were fraught with a lot more political overtones than we have given them in the New Testament.
And once you depoliticized a text for millennia, then anybody coming along saying, actually, there are significant political overtones and implications of this text, that is going to get pushed back, right? That's always going to get pushed back. And that's okay.
Right. What does Paul mean by salvation? If you had to, I know that's a huge question. You spend a lot of time on it, but I almost think that the way you handle salvation is emblematic of how you handle some of the other theological concepts in the book.
Well, salvation has, as Sylvia just pointed out, within the Hebrew Scriptures, invariably has geopolitical meaning.
Yep, absolutely.
Salvation means to be liberated from your oppressors. And to somehow think that when we get to the New Testament, it becomes incredibly individualistic. It's about your personal salvation. Kind of misses the point of the central metaphor of the ministry of Jesus of a kingdom. It's a kingdom of God. It's a rule. It's an alternative reign. So when Paul talks about salvation, he is talking about the reconciliation of all things. He's talking about the setting things right. And that includes individual life, but includes all of creation. All of creation is longing for redemption, Paul says. So salvation, it has to do with the reincorporation. I like the metaphor of incorporation because it has corporeality to it. It's an embodiedness, a reincorporation into the body of Christ and into the calling to which we are called as stewards, as justice makers in creation. So salvation sets free. It's the process of set bondage of adikia, wickedness or injustice, the bondage of the empire.
And for the characters we create in the book, so Iris, who is a Gentile slave, and Nereus, who is a Jewish freedman who lives just kind of at subsistence level. He can just mostly makes ends meet, but not always. For them, salvation language would have very practical overtones, right? For Iris, ideally, salvation would mean that she would be set free from her slavery. And she experiences that when she comes to the meetings of the other Jesus followers. She experiences a place where she's not treated like a slave. She experiences a place where she's given where she's able to share in exactly the same food as all the people who are higher than her in status. Yeah. She's found a new family again, because slaves, of course, in the Roman Empire weren't considered people. They were considered bodies and possessions. Even if they had children, those children were not their children. They were just the master's possessions. Yeah. She couldn't have a family. But so she finds in Jesus that freedom, which for her is salvation, to be part of this new community. That reminds her of when she was free, of when she was, before she had become a slave. So, it is personal, but also corporate, because it's in right. being part of that body that she finds that salvation.
And that's why it's so important that the corporate body not divide itself along the traditional cultural lines, right? That's why Paul in Corinthians is like, hey, just so you know, like some of you are falling asleep here because of this.
Yeah.
And I think one of the strengths of your work is really fleshing that out, both then and now. What does that practically look like in community formation? When you get to sexuality, and tell me how much or how little you'd love to talk about this. Obviously, it's a pretty incredibly complex issue, and it's one that I and all of my fellow, people who love Jesus and the church are trying to work through. And you get to Romans 1, which has obviously been pretty central in some of the discussions. How do you when you approach texts like these, again, a methodological question, how do you come from a place, do you enter the text through sorrow in this kind of the same way? How do you come at texts like this that have been so polarizing and explosive?
Well, yes. I mean, one of the ways we entered Romans 1 as a text of sorrow was thinking about that whole bit from Romans 1:18 and following, which talks about the idolatry that surrounds Paul, the behaviors that idolatry gives rise to, the sexual violence, the economic violence that you get after that. Everybody's been so focused on those texts about sex, nobody noticed he's talking about economics after the next little bit. All of that for Paul, Paul is talking about God's deep sorrow about these things. So that's the first thing. And he actually, in the beginning of chapter 2, then kind of turns it around and says, of course, don't judge. You're all, God's been grieved about all of you for these behaviors. But then there's also the question about, just historical context, basic historical context questions that we ask about anything, right? We don't phone people at the IRS and tell them that they're sinners because they're tax collectors, because tax collectors are clearly sinners in the first century, right? There were different things going on. Tax collectors in the first century, were, kind of the collaborators with the Romans, right? And,
right.
We don't necessarily want to project that on our civil service, though some of us might be tempted, but we don't go there because it's not directly analogous. So the question is what we're talking about now in terms of sexuality and same-sex marriage or homosexuality, is that the same thing as what Paul was talking about when he was talking about sexual violence? And, on the one hand, we're talking about an orientation that we now know is not chosen. Paul had no sense of anything like that, right? For him, he lived in a world where men were attracted to women and women were attracted to men, and that's the way it was. That's anything different would be unusual, even though Paul was surrounded by a culture where sexual violence happened against slave boys, boys of lower status, by men, right? So pederasty, the sexual use of young boys by men was very common in Paul's culture. The way that was interpreted wasn't in terms of same-sex orientation. It was interpreted as, this is how you blow off some steam. Because, of course, women had to be virgins when they got married. So, it wasn't the case that men could kind of, and now men did blow off steam with.
Nice metaphor
there. Yeah. There were temple prostitutes, there were other prostitutes, but by and large, slaves were there for the sexual use of their masters, right? And their masters' friends. And, you had slaves who were male and slaves who were female. And it was just interpreted as, this is what you did to deal with your unbridled sexual passions. You used little boys because they were kind of like women, right? That's how things worked. Romans chapter 1 was written in a context, and don't forget, this is written to Rome, the capital city where the emperor lived. People knew what the emperor got up to, partly because Caligula, the emperor, not at the time Paul wrote, but some people might have heard of Caligula. He was the emperor too before Nero. Nero was the emperor with a security detail and raped people that they found, men or women. Both of them were known for their sexual exploits and their with both men and women, and for their despicable way of trying to sully high status women. So they would rape high status women. So this stuff was talked about, right? Because this was the capital. You know, people in Washington talk about a lot more things that happen in Washington than what hits the news. Right. Because there's a grapevine. And so people in Rome knew about this, but of course they also saw this kind of sexual violence in their own lives, right? Mass slaves.
Because weren't the households patterned after the imperial household in that way?
The households were definitely patterned. So, you know, the sexual violence of the imperial household, that happened in the normal households. People wore the clothes that the emperor was wearing, right? They tried to model their hairstyles on the hairstyles of the imperial house. So yeah, that was the model for, you know, what held society together. So when Paul's writing about, you know, these sexual practices, degrading sexual practices, what people would have thought of is those kind of violent sexual practices that men perpetrated against younger men or boys in the imperial house. And when Paul talks about women engaging in unnatural sex, it's not at all clear that he's talking about women. The church fathers...
You mean women with women?
Women with women. The church fathers interpreted that as women engaged in unnatural acts with men. So in the goddess temples or elsewhere, and you've got to remember in the ancient world, oral sex could be considered unnatural, because it was a status issue as well. So you know, things that we don't think of in terms of status and power in our culture were considered that in the first century. So it's not till the fourth century that it's thought that that's actually referring, my apologies, to two women. And so that would have been completely out of Paul's radar, I think, since nobody seems to have thought he was talking about that. So are these texts referring to what we're talking about when we talk about gay marriage? I don't think so. That's just a completely different context. It doesn't work.
But the texts are talking about sexuality, and they're talking about an injustice, because God, you know, this is the God's wrath is manifest against the wickedness, adikia, the injustice of human life and the ungodliness of human life, because what can be known about God has been clearly known through creation. So then you've got to say, well, what's he talking about there? Right. Is it talking about male-female binaries? No, because that's about male-female relationships. You said, well, what can be known about God? So you need to then ask, well, where in Paul's scriptures do we see anything that creation teaches us about God? And the answer is, of course, the Psalms. And if you look at Psalm 19 and Psalm 33 and Psalm 98 and I think maybe 148, in these Psalms, creation bears witness to the very character of God. And the character of God is that God is a God of steadfast love, there's fidelity in love, justice, and compassion. So what Paul is attacking in Romans 1 are sexual patterns of life, and then also economic patterns of life that do not reflect God's justice, compassion, and faithfulness. So we actually think that Paul, underlying his critique, and then we trace this throughout the rest of our book, but underlying his critique is actually a normative vision of what it means to be created in the image of God, and what that means for our sexual lives and for our economic lives. So let me say one last thing. We could go on and on about this particular topic. You ask, is there a sorrow that is brought to the reading of these texts? And the answer is yes, there is another sorrow. And that is the sorrow of our LGBTQ plus friends. And some might say, oh, so you're reading this way because you have gay friends. Yeah, sure we are. That doesn't disqualify our reading. It might give us a certain angle and perspective on our reading, and then it's up to others to evaluate that reading, and that's fair game. So in the chapter of our book where we talk about sexuality, we end by bearing witness. We bear witness to the faithful lives and the lives of justice and the steadfast love and compassion of a whole bunch of our gay friends. And we name them, because we think it's time that we name those folks whose lives have borne witness to us of what Christian discipleship should look like.
Mm-hmm. Holy moly. And we haven't hit creation yet. I mean, holy cow, you have a whole chapter on that is mind-blowing. Cell phones and watersheds and unbelievable.
And how about drinking water out of plastic bottles, Mike?
Yeah. Exactly.
Sorry, man, exactly. Just had to call you out.
No, my goodness. It is, listen. And oh boy, here he is. Ladies and gentlemen, Seth. Can you say hi to Miss Sylvia and Mr. Brian?
Hi, Sylvia and Brian.
Okay.
Hi, Seth. How are you?
How are you?
Good.
Are you good? Hey, we're recording right now, okay?
Yeah.
All right, so I need you to go out that way. Perfect. There you go.
Bye-bye. Thanks for the kiss.
See, he's my entrance into a lot of texts that I would never have had before.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
What's that? I mean, it's pretty amazing how that works. So, yes, in plastic bottles. I'm going to do a whole intro talking about your book that I will spare you because I don't want you to, get too cocky. But I just want to say I just want to say thank you both for taking time today. I know you've got lots going on, and I'm very grateful you take some time. So I'm going to count us down. I'm going to stop recording, and then I'd love to just say thank you one more time, okay?
It's been our pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Oh, my goodness. You guys are amazing. All right. So, Vox community, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord shine his face upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance to you, and in these days may he give us peace. Until next time, friends, thank you for listening.
All right, everyone. It was so good to listen to that. We're trying something new, which is based on some feedback we got. We're going to, every time we interview somebody that has like something that we all are interested in hearing or saying, we want to give them the platform to show their best stuff, just like we just heard. And then Tim, Mike, and I are going to come on and sort of debrief and discuss out loud what it is we thought of it.
Yes. Sylvia and Brian, what'd you think, Bonnie?
Dang. Okay. I would like to say first and foremost, this is one of the first times I've ever done this. I finished listening and I went and ordered their book on Amazon.
Oh, wow.
I was so intrigued by it.
Oh, yeah.
I was so intrigued. I think a few things. I think it was a really good piggyback conversation from the Gombis one about hermeneutics, just about how they approach the text.
Yeah.
I thought that was extremely interesting because kind of like he said, I don't know, you get this feeling, the way that we've been doing it, we need a new construct. We need a new approach. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Something that I felt, well, there's a few things. I want to talk about the sexuality chapter that they discussed.
Yep.
But before that, what did you think about when they were talking about the political overtones that happen in scripture, right? So obviously there's politics in Old Testament and New Testament, but I'm not sure how I feel about, or what I understand to be, thus then we make it like about our own politics, if that makes sense. Like I've always understood it to go, okay, so there's political overtones here, so this is what it meant, but I'm not sure about the transferring then into kind of mirroring it to our politics.
Right. Oh, that's so good. That's so good. And that is something, I mean, when you read the book, it is, I mean, they go from Romans into water tables and how you manage trash and how you treat, at least in Canada, the first people, the First Nations people. I think that's there was I'm not familiar enough with the controversy to know what they're referring to, but yes, they turn it. I mean, they go pretty far, and I think their argument would simply be, listen, this has always been anti-imperial, and because empire exists, it's not just a thing, but it's sort of a power and principality that's always in the world. Therefore, it always is to be resisted, and so we have to.
Right.
How does empire manifest itself here? Well, I mean, they would argue it's American nationalism, it's individualism, it's consumerism, it's anti-environmentalism, blah 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 blah.
Right.
But I'm with you in the sense of, I don't doubt that justification or righteousness or that would have been good news for people on the margins and have political overtones. I have no question about that. And I don't question whether or not there would be political overtones today. What I do question is the translation of those political overtones into a X vision, a conservative vision, or a progressive vision, or a libertarian vision, right?
Right.
I don't know. That's the part. So I'd go one step further and say that's the part I don't know how you map. Without just getting into speculation.
Right. Well, and would you agree? Because I come from this standpoint of like, anytime we're going to do any type of reading into the text or translating it, isn't even possible to do it unbiasedly.
Right?
I'm not sure that it is.
Well, yeah,
Do you know?
the gift of postmodernism has been to recognize the reader's context matters,
right,
and not just the author's context.
Right. And so that
Absolutely.
comes with good and bad, though, because that's really good because we're trying to figure out how to use this ancient book for today. But I worry, like you just said, I don't think it does the text actually any justice, because to me, it's the same thing as proof texting something. As saying, I'm looking for, kind of like what Gambas was talking about, of like you're coming up with almost a Bible code situation.
Right.
Right. So like for you, and like, what is the line there for the lens? Like, how much can we read into something and make it exactly parallel? And how much do we go, this is the essence of it? Am I making sense when I ask you that? Like, I feel like there's a line, but I'm not sure what it is. It just, their conversation fell over my line for the best as I can explain it.
Right. Oh man. And just wait, Bonnie, till you read this thing. Yeah. So they are working at the level of worldview. And N.T. Wright, Walsh actually has done some work with N.T. Wright on worldview stuff. And the questions that N.T. wrestles with in terms of who are we, what is wrong, I think where is it going, what time is it, like those big questions. And then you get into symbols and praxis and the ways in which worldview gets fleshed out. So they're operating at that level and saying, okay, what are the symbols? What's the praxis? What's the, who are we in 21st century Western culture? What's wrong? What's our prescription? What time it is? And so they're combining. They're trying to say, in the same way that the Pauline retelling of the gospel was subversive to the Roman story, right, to the Pauline telling of the gospel subversive to the American story. And in that general sense, I think that is absolutely true. Right. I agree. Right. So I'm totally with them to that point. The issue is, and I'll frame it slightly different. They very much oppose weaponizing Romans in a certain direction. Right. And that immediately opens up the countercharge. Well, they've just weaponized it too. Yeah. But, in a much different way. Yeah. And then, so the question, I couldn't get there in the interview. The question was like, how do we avoid weaponizing texts at all? Or is that even possible if you have an opinion on them? Yeah. Right? The instant you have an opinion on them, is it possible to weaponize them? The answer seems to be yes. So for me, what I began to do was, what the strength of the book was how they put you in a socioeconomic reality so that you would hear with first century ears how these words and concepts. So when Paul starts by saying, I'm a slave of Jesus Christ, that to us, we're like, okay, if you were a slave in the first century in Rome and you're hearing Paul title himself thusly, I mean, that's a staggering thing. So they pick up on the socioeconomic good news of this on the Romans, from the Romans. And I think they're just trying to map that then on, well, how do the marginalized folks hear the same good news? And how would they feel the same things if you're one of the indigenous people, or if you're a sexual minority or whatever? Yeah. So I think all of that's legit. The issue is again, for me, the mapping of specific policy recommendations over hermeneutical and exegetical considerations. Yeah. You know, and so for the line for me, to get finally back to your question, is elevating those policy considerations to the level of this is biblical.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, you know I think I totally do. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because what I want the text to do or be treated as is to understand the original context and then to let it sit there and then let us all work it out. Right. Versus it like being put in writing, I guess. Yeah. That doesn't make too much. I mean, that's the construct, the platform they have, but. Yes.
And so the thing that's so compelling about them, though, is they live out this radical economic vision. Yeah. I mean, and you're just like, my goodness, this is so, I mean, I told him this, I think I was off there. I just said, so many theologians I meet, I would never want to emulate. Right. Their theology is great, but they are as people, they're just not. There's nothing about them you'd say, no, I want to be like that. But these two,
and that made sense because when she talked about salvation having practical overtones, yes. I wrote that like 3 different times in my notes, it like all bold, because to me, like, that they literally are living that out. Like it's a practical thing to not use these plastic water bottles or whatever it is. You know what I mean? And I was like, like that really hit home for me in terms of like, that's what we're talking about when we talk about kingdom here and now. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So that makes total sense with what they were saying when she said salvation would have been understood as having real practical overtones. Right. So the way that they're living that out makes total sense. And it also makes me inclined to believe them and be compelled by the way that they're living it out. Do you know what I mean? Because it is a practical thing then to not use plastic water bottles or, whatever it is that they've put in place. Absolutely. Yeah. And they've identified one of the biggest disconnects of traditional evangelical Christianity, which is the separation from the spiritual aspect of salvation from everything else. Right. And so salvation just becomes about our forgiveness and our souls, our invisible souls going to the invisible heaven or whatever. Right. When we die, and instead for them, the creation care, and they have a whole chapter on this that just riffs off of Paul's groaning. What he says, the creation groans, and they just riff on this. So I love, and that's what's so challenging is you can get past the policies or whatever, but there's a deep conviction about, this, like in the first century, these sorts of common meals meant the reordering of the social world of the first century, right? When you and they play this out in really creative ways. When you show up as a slave to a church service and everyone's sharing a meal, slave or free, male or female, Jew or Greek, all of a sudden you're like, this is a whole new thing, and we've lost that bit of it into our world. And so I recommend the book. It's just gonna be super thought provoking. Yeah, absolutely. Tim, what did you? Oh, hold on. No, go ahead. I was gonna go to the next topic, but nice. Tim, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, those things. I was having a conversation with somebody the other night when we were talking about this community idea here in Auburn.
Yeah. Yep.
And about what it means to work with marginalized people. And then we kind of had like a short little back and forth about the political issues of it. And how, the person I was talking with was talking about how important it is to be involved politically and to vote for this and that, X, Y, and Z. And I was like, yeah, but I think it's really interesting to be way ahead of that and try to affect change in policy by affecting the issues at the bottom level. If that makes sense. And I feel like they're talking about a lot of that stuff where it's like you are getting involved in the actual issues at hand, the things that are the core tenets of what it is that you would normally wait to argue about at the end result. Or, we're really good at fighting political issues at the political level and debating and arguing on Facebook and whatever. And it's a huge divisive thing. It's a huge divisive thing within the Christian community as well as the American community and whatnot. But what was that? There's that. I can't remember the author's name. He wrote the book. He was like the guy that started the Sojourners.
Jim Wallace.
Yes. He wrote a book called God's Politics I read a long, long time ago. And I'm sure that book is divisive as well. But he was talking about Martin Luther King and Martin Luther King trying to affect policy at the top level and how that wasn't working. So he went back to the bottom level and tried to, and Wallace called it changing the course of the wind, like affecting the way in which the wind is blowing rather than just reacting to the effect of the wind, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
A lot of what they're talking about is kind of like that, like, as you guys are talking about them living out their beliefs at the bottom level, and then that kind of permeates out and reverberates up throughout everything else is very inspiring and very, I don't know, you just rarely see people who are really actually living out the things that they talk about or the things that they say are important all the way down to like the foundational level.
Right.
Well, like for the long haul, you know what I mean? Like, I think they're in it. They move to a farm. They're doing it. They're not like, this month we did an experiment or whatever.
When I was listening to them, I was like, these guys are like granola punk rock.
Yes. they're probably
the first question you asked them was about where do you see Christianity today or whatever, and you're just like, it's just not dying fast enough. And I was like, all right,
like laid it out. Yeah.
Well, now we're off. Let's go.
I know. They were just so awesome. All right, buddy. Next topic for you.
Okay. Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to discuss, I was so intrigued, and this is what actually made me click the buy now on Amazon. I was very intrigued about what they were talking about when you asked them about sexuality. And he said, in Paul's world, we read into it what homosexuality means today and heterosexuality and what's happening. But in Paul's world, it wasn't that at all. Like that. He didn't even have the same frame of reference. And so I wanted to bring that up because with the other conversations we've had over the past few weeks here, is I'm intrigued by any topic, whether it be LGBTQ, whether women in ministry, anything like that. I'm intrigued by the idea and notion that we are approaching this text in this completely different way of going like, that's not what they meant. So we can't proof text it. We can't look at it and proof text it. But my question then is, how do you know, and what would you say, how do you know when it seems to me that it's a completely different world? So Paul isn't talking about literally probably anything we're talking about. So even in women in ministry, for example, which is obviously a hill I die on a lot, and I'm wondering, like, have I even been approaching these the right way? Because we do a lot of explaining. Okay, Paul says this, but he means this. This is a situation, whatever. Again, where do you draw the line? Where do you say, I'm going to take the essence of what they said and apply it now versus like, we can't even do that because they're not talking at all about what we're talking about, if that makes sense. And if that's the case, like, for example, in the LGBTQ plus community, if that's the case, then it doesn't seem that you could come to an affirming standpoint based on the scriptures, if that makes sense.
You could not?
Yeah, like to me, that's what they're saying. That's what I'm hearing is like, we can't take something that we can't proof text these texts at all or like explain it away and apply it to today because it's not at all the same situation or language. So then I'm wondering, what do you do then? What do you do with that?
Well, for them, they affirm. I mean, that led them to an affirming posture.
Right. But what I guess I didn't read it, so I don't really know. But in your like, what's the process there? Because we've been talking so much about biblical process and how to do it.
Right.
You know, he talks so much about you can't use systematic theology. Gambas is like, you can't do hermeneutic. So I'm like, what are we left with?
Yes. No, that's so good. And so Gambas and I were riffing on an article by Kevin Van Hooser. Yeah,
I think you said that right. Mm-hmm.
And NT does this, and Walsh does this about the idea of improvising. That you see the text as a script, right? The NT uses this. You know this one, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so we have to be immersed in the text in order to improvise it faithfully. Mm-hmm. And what we have at our disposal is we have tradition, we have the scripture, the living and active scripture itself, we have community, and we have the Spirit.
Right.
And so that in that web, we are improvising daily about what faith looks like. And that part's true in the sense of, you know, the Bible doesn't talk about in vitro or Amazon Prime Day and whether or not I should resist it, right? I mean,
right.
And so we'll have all sorts of interesting conversations. But the question you're asking, which is the most important question, is what defines faithful improvisation versus unfaithful improvisation? Improvisation, excuse me. So. And people here will obviously, and this is where they engage with Tom Wright a bunch because NT's take on Romans has been Paul is actually familiar with same-gendered romantic relationships, and they disagree with that,
right?
And I tend to side. There's a very affirming scholar, a couple who just say, no, I think the Bible's pretty clearly non-affirming, and it's just wrong. You know, that's
interesting, right?
Yeah. That's the one thing. That's the one sort of argument that I am fascinated by. But that's a different story. So somebody like NT would question the claim. They had no conception of
romantic relationship,
of same-gendered romantic faithful relationships. The very interesting thing that Keesmaat and Walsh do in their book is they actually argue, because the big counter to the affirming take on Romans 1 is that it's, you know, primarily dealing with power.
Right.
Has been the fact that Paul seemingly brings up lesbianism, which was not a power relationship.
Right.
And what these two do is they actually deal with that in a way I've never heard before. And so because the typical rhetorical moves are, hey, Paul wasn't talking about orientation here. The counter is, well, actually he was aware of X, Y, and Z. And the counter to that is, well, he may have been aware of it, but they always existed in power differentials. Mm-hmm. And then the counter to that counter is, yeah, but then why would he mention lesbians that did not exist in power differentials? And then Keesmaat and Walsh have a counter to that I'm sure has been out there forever. But was the idea that Paul wasn't referencing women having same gendered erotic acts with other women, but doing things that were considered unnatural with men.
Right. That's what I've always read it as.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all that is to say, the line the line is super fascinating. Bonnie just got up out of her chair, looked over at Cy or a kid. I can't tell
I
which.
locked the door so the 2-year-old did not enter.
It's so funny. I've got a Seth roaming around. We all have children. This is the joy of podcasting in 21st century America. So all that is to say, this is, and they get into some Leviticus stuff and I'm not sure about that. That was one area where I was like, I've heard some pretty compelling stuff that what Paul's doing in Corinthians is riffing on Leviticus in more than just the temple prostitution sense. But all that is to say, the book's super interesting, and I wanted to ask them about sexuality because that you could tell that there they were pretty forceful, but they were nodding a lot to NT because they're disagreeing with him.
Right.
And so I thought it was just not cute, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like a fun sort of dynamic behind the dynamic.
Yeah, I know.
So anyway, I mean, it's definitely, this is a very, very, our progressive friends, like if you're really out there, like on progressive policy, you will just love this. If you're a very conservative policy person, you're gonna react to the policy. But neither one of those should be primarily dancing on policy. The point they're making, which is utterly profound to me anyway, is that salvation has practical consequences.
Yeah,
and they can't help but be political.
Yeah,
and economic.
And I like that. And that's why I brought up the question about the LGBTQ that they talked about and how you approach the text, because I think that it seems right now polarized in our society that certain people that approach the text a certain way come out with these certain outcomes and vice versa. But I'm compelled into learning how people get to where they are.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Because I think sometimes my own bias and my own blinders aren't necessarily my outcome, but how I arrived there. And so I'm really compelled by their, just like you said, their practical overtones and the way they've dealt with the text in a way that might be new or different. Right.
No, absolutely. And they do that with all of Romans.
Yeah, I know. I'm excited to read it.
This is like a thick book, but they do that with all of Romans. So, it's one of those things where, and this is what's coming at me. Now, back to your question about, what's the big question is, what's the Bible for? Mm-hmm. What's it supposed to do in us? And I've been really wrestling with that. I've been reading some John Walton about law. Mm-hmm. I've been reading Pete Enns' latest, How the Bible Works. The Gambas stuff, man, I've been really going back and reading Gambas stuff. And they're all arguing that the goal of the scriptures, obviously it's salvation in one sense and revelation in another sense, but practically it's wisdom. Right. That what we're not trying to find 8 steps to God's will. Wisdom is knowing what the right thing to do is in situations where we're confronted with conditions that aren't covered in Scripture. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that's the discipline. How do you cultivate wisdom? Mm-hmm. Well, and in that sense, Gambas is right. It's not just a method that cultivates wisdom. Right. And it's not just. Although it includes method and it includes my context, but it's bigger than that. And I think that's the part that's super interesting. Agreed. Is okay, we have people in Jesus' name looking at the clobber texts used in LGBTQ conversations, saying, hey, we've read these wrong. You've got 2,000 years of church history that says no, and Jewish worldview that says, no, this is... the Jewish conception of homosexuality was bigger than just power differentials, right? And temple prostitution, and again, that's a debatable point. But right, if that's true, then it's tough for me to take Jesus out of his Jewish context, regardless of what Paul's saying in Romans. But the idea of Scripture and why it comes to us in such a messy way. is the idea that it's cultivating in us discernment and wisdom, right? The relational kind of walking with God. And that's why it's so varied and so messy and so comes in so many different forms, is that there isn't one way to capture this big kingdom movement that God has, been working on and through and towards since the beginning. So anyway, I'm rambling a bit, but I'm taking your thought and going, yes, I'm fascinated by that too. Not just in the sense of how my context leads me blindly to certain conclusions, but also I've always thought the goal of the Bible to be right information leading to right relationship with God.
Right.
And there's part of that's true.
Part of it's in there.
That is true. But it's bigger and it's more relational. And so how do you live wisely, right?
Well, and isn't that so the tension? When you have these big issues like LGBTQ and women in ministry and different things, is to say, what if I postured myself towards wisdom and going, how can I live wisely and discerning and in this tension, not just towards right answer? Right. And I don't know. So that this book kind of, I think the way they approach it brings that up a little bit for me. So, yeah.
And they have, I'm sorry, Bonnie, to interrupt you.
No, you're good.
They have a hermeneutic of sorrow.
Yes, that was really clear too.
To me.
Mm-hmm.
And the book starts with this hermeneutic of sorrow, and I was like, wow. So they lament a lot, and it's super fascinating. So yes, I mean this. We're embodying what the book is.
Right. Yeah.
It's very thought-provoking.
Yeah, it's really good. So we hope you guys enjoyed listening to this. We'd love to hear your thoughts, but also we are going to give away a copy of the book.
Boom.
Which is super fun. So there'll be more details on our Facebook and Instagram, but I think it's going to be something like comment one thing that you learned or question you had or thought provoking you had, and then we'll do like a randomized generator to pick a winner and send them the book, because I just think it'd be cool for listeners to get their hands on what we're talking about.
I love it. And this was all Bonnie. This is the millennial mind that we have lacked. I mean, Tim and I are Pearl Jam fans. Tim,
I'm
how old
just
are
coming
you?
in with Taylor Swift and marketing ideas.
Yes. Tim, how old are you?
I just turned 40 this year.
Yes. So Tim and I are in our 40s. I'm going to group us together.
There you go.
And Bonnie, you are in your
30s.
Oh, man.
But can I tell you, for a while at my old job, I pretended just like to one or two people that I was 50. Because
that's funny.
It was online and they didn't see me, so I just thought it would be hilarious then when they saw me. And they were so nice. They were like, "You look so good for 50." And I was like, "Oh, that's good, because I'm not."
Because if you don't know, if you've never seen Bonnie has the remarkable gift of she's looked like she's 20 for the last 15 years. It's been absolutely crazy. So, all right. So anyway, hope you liked the afterglow.
Yeah, let
after
us know
show.
how you like this debrief.
It's a debrief. Tim, I thought Tim's comments were very insightful.
As always.
All right. Well, we'll give you the last word, Tim.
I don't know if I should. The trash man's coming through right now. It's going to be awfully loud.
This is middle age. This is it. Locking the door, hiding from our children.
Worried about the trash man. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Although I will say, and I know this is lame, but like seeing our trash removed is one of the highlights of my week.
That is weird.
It is weird. Like, because our trash people, they take anything.
Oh, ours do too. And piles of it. What day does your trash person come?
Oh, Wednesday. So my day today is make Nate pick up the small trashes, and then I go rummaging through our shed and garage, and I just throw stuff out there.
Oh,
Yeah, it's
that's
so
gotta feel
opposite in
good.
California, where you like if you overflow your can by like
Exactly.
They
they're
charge
like,
you.
Sorry,
Yeah, can't do it.
no
this,
dice.
I mean,
Ours
Go
are
ahead.
so good, and Sai's like really into it, like you are. And sometimes he jumps on his longboard and chases him down the street with like boxes on his shoulder.
oh man.
But ours is on Monday, so you really start fresh.
Oh.
Yeah, that's
See,
nice.
Yeah, Wednesday's tough because you're not. Yeah. I want to start fresh, or I want it on Friday, so I go into the weekend. The thing about Monday that would be great is it'd give me the weekend to kind of set stuff out.
Yeah, there
You know what I mean? Because I rummage, and they take. I mean, they've taken broken mirrors and recliners.
Right.
So signs you know you're old.
I love trash day.
Older then.
I love trash day.
You don't know the highlight of my week.
It's watching the trash guys show up and take all my crap and throw it in a landfill, in which Keesmaat and Walsh would be like,
I was
"What
gonna
the
say,
H are
full
you
circle.
doing?"
They're gonna come to your house on a Wednesday.
Seriously, my goodness.
And their biodiesel.
Yes. All right, Bonnie, why don't you do our blessing, and then we'll let
I
the
don't
poor
know the
people
blessing
go.
by heart.
Okay.
You do it.
All right, I'll do it.
Okay.
Tim, do you know it?
The problem with how I know it is we used to. So at church, every time we lead
boy.
worship, we would sing.
Sing
a
it.
blessing at the end.
Sing it.
And so
Sing
we
it.
had Aaron. I'm
Now
not singing it
it's
right now,
time.
but we
Sing
had,
it. Come on.
Yeah.
Come on.
I don't even have the real microphone on.
Tim.
May the
Tim.
Lord bless you and keep you. Come on.
I'll do it one of these times. I actually was thinking about I'll record it because I also used to close church with the Jude 24:25.
Yeah.
We do that as a song as well, just to offer a blessing to people as we're leaving.
Yeah.
I'll record one of those one time and we'll put it
Well,
up.
I don't know. I'm recording right now. So why
So
don't
this
you
seems
just...
like a good time.
Listen,
Yes.
guys, I just rolled out of bed.
It's true.
It's not noon.
All right. Well, then, our friends, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord shine his face upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift his countenance to you. And in these days, give us peace.
I'm going to remix that.
Especially on trash day.
Yes, exactly. All right. Until next time, friends. Bye.
Bye.